I'm very excited to be here today. I'm going to give a very short version of a talk that my colleague Chris, who's over there, and I have given at the Hacker Conference Chaos Communication Congress in Leipzig in December. What is Privacy International? We are a non-profit that works on government surveillance and privacy around the world. And here are some of the research and investigations we've done. In this talk, I want to talk about a project or research that Chris and I have done on third-party tracking in Android apps. Who in the room has ever built an Android app or an app? Perfect. And who is a data journalist? Cool. So as you might know or not know, more than 42% of all free apps in the Android Play Store share some form of data with Facebook. What we wanted to do with this research, this is a static analysis. We wanted to investigate and dig deeper and see what this looks like in practice. The reason we looked at Facebook as one third-party tracker, there are many more companies, is that when you're opening an app like Spotify or Duolingo on an Android phone and you don't even have a Facebook account, you don't necessarily expect that it would share data with Facebook. Here are some of the apps that we looked at, and we deliberately chose apps with a large install base because we're very conscious of the fact that there are apps that are just being maintained by a single person. So those are very popular apps with at least 10 and 500 million installs each. And here's what we found. We found that over 60% of the apps that we tested automatically transfer personal data to Facebook the second you open the app. Here's what this looks like. This is an example for Kayak. That is actually it's vKontakte, the Russian social network app. And the data that the app immediately transmits the second you open the app is personal data under European privacy laws. It's your advertisement ID. So it uniquely identifies you, and it tells a third party, in this case Facebook, about the fact that you're using this app and when you're using it. Here's our second finding. We found that some apps also share data that is incredibly detailed and sometimes sensitive. So those are findings from the app Kayak. You can see, you probably can't see, but you could see, if you could see it, you could see that Kayak shares your journey, so your exact searches, where you're traveling from and where you're traveling to, whether you're traveling with children and what kind of class you're traveling in. And again, this happens whether you have a Facebook account or not, and regardless of whether you're logged in. Why does any of this matter, you might ask? And that is, I think it's a good question. Why does it matter? First of all, the apps that we looked at are quite sensitive, and if a third party knows that you're using these particular apps in combination, it reveals quite a lot of things about you. Sorry, that was not on purpose. So for example, we looked at a Muslim prayer app, we looked at a period tracker, we looked at a job search app, and then we looked at a children's app. Knowing that somebody uses these 4 apps says a lot about that person. That person is very likely Muslim, very likely a woman, female, very likely a job seeker, and very likely a parent. That's quite a lot of information. The second argument is, so the apps we looked at, combined, they had over 2 billion combined installs. So this refers to, this affects a lot of users. And I think it's quite interesting also from a competition perspective, a third party that knows what kinds of apps more than 42% of free apps in the Android Play Store use has quite a unique insight into the market, what apps are popular, when people are using them, and what kinds of people are using them. So it raises competition questions. Also, I think in general, third-party tracking is a complete nightmare. Facebook isn't necessarily the worst offender, and since we work around the world, we work in many emerging markets with very little laws and protections. Today, a journalist contacted me about a story of health apps and the kinds of data they shared. So I think this is a broader problem that we looked at here. We also did an update. We retested all the apps in March this year, and we have some positive, exciting news. 2/3 of the apps that we've tested have updated their apps, and they no longer share data with Facebook the way that we have originally discovered. And this includes big apps like Spotify, Skyscanner, etc. And here are the bad news. Many apps, including a Bible app, a Muslim prayer app, Indeed as well. We haven't retested, they might have updated it by now, but in March they hadn't. Still send the data. And many apps that remove the Facebook tracking still do other sorts of problematic tracking. So it's sort of like good and bad news at the same time. What can you do? I wasn't 100% sure about the audience, even though I attended Hex Hackers events in Berlin. But there are some exciting things you can do. First of all, we want you to replicate our research. We have released our testing environment on our website. You can find it there. And there are many more apps that need to be tested, and it's very fascinating, if you're a journalist, to discover what kinds of data apps share with third parties in general. But also, if you are building apps, I think you should really rethink third-party tracking. And the reason is, all liability is with you. In the Facebook case, Facebook shifts all liability to apps. We think it's more complicated, but it is definitely an open question. So we think if you use third-party trackers, use them very selectively in a manner that's transparent and fair towards users. Don't transmit data that you don't need to transmit. It sounds trivial and basic, but it's really not often the case. And finally, give people a genuine choice. It's impossible to opt out of third-party tracking in apps. It's very different from tracking in web browsers, where you can block advertisement, you can block tracking, but apps give users a very little choice. Give them a choice. And that's it. If you have any further questions, either to my colleague Chris or me, I'm happy to answer them.
I have a lot of questions, but the first one was, so why did you pick Android? Is that just for the sample size, or is there something about Android versus other platforms that is unique that yields these results? And do you have any data on iPhone, etc.?
No, the same. So others were able to replicate the findings for iOS. So there was the same problem. The reason why we picked Android was that we work internationally, and Android is the operating system that is used by more people. That's the only reason.
Thanks. A lot of what you described reminded me of what Exodus Privacy does, which, for context, is a French non-profit org that does also all sort of static analysis on Android apps, and in order to detect privacy, well, everything that could be bad for users' privacy. Did you interact with them during their research? Did you include them? Did you collaborate with them in that research?
I'm glad you asked. In the longer version of the talk, we did give them extensive credit, and everybody else who's done work on this. Yes, absolutely. I think my favorite tool that they offer is as a browser add-on for the Google Play Store, where you can see what kinds of trackers an app includes, so you can make choices. For example, if you're downloading a health app, you might not necessarily want that health app to share lots of data with third parties if you're maybe secretive about your condition or something. And in those cases, that's really relevant.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. Have you managed to, did you have conversations with any governments about this? And how did they respond to those conversations?
Yes, that's a good question. So we didn't go, so we published this together with a very long report that has an extensive legal section. So basically the short answer is yes. When we replicated our research, we contacted the European Data Protection Supervisor and the European Data Protection Board. So those are the regulators who are responsible for this. But I think the broader question is this. In the way that personal data is defined in Europe, this is personal data. In many parts of the around the world, it isn't, because it is pseudonymized. It doesn't contain your name. It contains a number that can uniquely identify you, and it's quite trivial to then link it back to a name. So I think this is like, it's something that you can only tackle legally in jurisdictions that have very strong laws. But even here, so what we observed raises a lot of legal questions. Because sort of like your personal data is transmitted before you have a chance to agree. You don't always have to agree, but in this instance, there are good arguments why you should. And I think it's a bit troubling to say that we have these laws, and basically it shows that there's a massive enforcement gap in something that actually is quite relevant when you think about the prayer apps, the health apps, etc. Also, women can also ask questions. You can ask questions.
Sorry to ask a second question.
Yeah.
So, are there ways as an end consumer where, for example, you know, in Germany you have TÜV, or you have more mass market, you have like Trustpilot, etc., where that you could sort of give a certificate that Privacy International has checked this app and they don't transmit this data? Is there something like that that you're thinking about doing with this data to make it a bit more practical for the end consumer? Or are there things like that out there? Like as an end consumer, how do you, without going to the website and researching every single app that you have, is there sort of an easy way for you to figure out whether this is happening or not?
So there are some things in our report. We outline a number of things you can do, even though they have no effect on what we described, but there's still things that you should do. So for example, you can opt out of ad personalization on your phone. You can reset your ad ID regularly. You're still being tracked, but the profile is more, you can also link it back again. So basically the short answer is it's incredibly difficult, it's incredibly difficult to protect yourself from this. And ultimately, our philosophy is also that this isn't really your job. We think these things should be better by default. And we want laws to be strong and we want them to be enforced. And I always like to compare this to food security. I don't go into shops with my little testing kit and test whether a sandwich is safe. I just trust that it's safe because there are institutions around it that guarantee this. And I think we need to move towards the same thing with technology. But to give you an example, like I recently downloaded, I think it was a mood tracking app. Because I really, in this case, didn't want anything I input to be shared. And I read all the privacy policies of 10 apps, which frankly nobody else does. And not a single of them gave me comfort in using them. And I think that's a sad situation. And I think the moment that consumer awareness about this grows, that will be a problem. Yeah. Also, news apps are not also a bit problematic sometimes. If you're working on some of them, you can ask me questions in private if you want. We might have tested them.
Any final questions before we revert to private questions? Oh, there's one over there.
On the flip side, are there any apps that you're like, these are brilliant, these are really transparent, they're really good for the consumer, they tell you exactly what they're going to do?
We did there's an NGO, it's called Med Confidential, they look at medical apps, and we sort of, together with them, looked at a number of medical apps. And if you do this kind of interception that we did, so basically we intercepted the data that the apps transmit, it's really fascinating. In some apps, you open them, the moment you open them, there's pages and pages and pages of data, and there are others where they're just 6 or 7 lines. And then you can make your choices, and then they transmit data. I think that's the right way to go. And there were some, I think this relates to the earlier questions. We're a nonprofit, and we have a mission, and it's not our mission to endorse anything, because ultimately you never know, and then they change, and we would be responsible. So we don't really do this kind of positive recommendation. But I think if you build apps, there are ways to build apps and also use third parties in a way that's transparent and fair towards users. It's not rocket science. It's more, and I think it's quite shocking. These are really big apps with large teams of developers. And what we observed is kind of interesting that this was present in so many of these, initially at least.